U.S. European relations have seen trying times during the second Trump administration. And since launching the war in Iran, President Trump has been heavily critical of NATO countries for not more directly joining the fight. Still, many European countries have played vital supporting roles to the United States in its war against Iran. While transatlantic tensions may continue to rise because of this war, my guest today argues that ultimately the war will leave Europe more dependent on the United States. I'm Adam Gallagher, a contributing fellow at Defense Priorities, and today I'm going to be speaking with Defense Priorities non-resident fellow Thomas Cavanna about the impact of this war on the trajectory of U.S. European relations. Here are three things you need to know. Hey, Thomas, thanks for joining me today. I was hoping you could start off by just talking a little bit about how European countries have responded to the war so far, and also walk us through kind of like broadly, because of course there's many European countries, what interests these countries have at stake in this war.
Hi, Adam. Thank you for having me. Of course, great questions. I would start by saying that before the war, there was still an overlap between the American position vis-a-vis Iran and the European position, which is that the Europeans considered Iran as a threat or potential threat because of its nuclear program, ballistic missile program, because of its support to terrorist proxies, and because of its ruthless regime. However, the Europeans so far, to the extent that we can generalize, have not been enthusiastic about the war that the US and Israel launched on February 28th. And I think one aspect of this, if we look at it from a general perspective, is that first, the Europeans did not see an imminent threat coming from Iran. Second, they also resented the fact that the Trump administration did not consult them. There was also an issue with international law and how the United States and Israel bypassed the United Nations. And there is also the fact that the end game, as you know, is not very clear. Like the war goals have changed over time, and there is a kind of feeling that the war could last for a very long time because there is no real plan. If we look at it more specifically from the European perspective, I would also add that many European leaders feel vulnerable. I think there is an economic vulnerability that we are already seeing and that could get far worse if we look at energy supply disruptions, if we look at inflation, so consequences for European economies that are not doing so well already before the war. I think there's also a concern about the security dimension. And here we have potential connections between the war in Iran and the war in Ukraine. The possibility that the US would, further reduce its support to Ukraine, that the US would kind of neglect the peace negotiations with Russia. And there is also the idea that on the other side, Russia has benefited from the war, especially because of rising energy prices. I think there's also a fear of refugee flows into Europe, as happened during past Middle Eastern crises. So all these are frustrations and concerns in Europe. The Europeans have been very clear so far. It could change, but so far they have been pretty clear that they do not want to intervene directly. For example, They have declined the Trump administration's demand that they intervene in the Strait of Hormuz as part of the coalition. But I think it's also important to emphasize that Europe's response overall has been pretty weak. If we leave aside some exceptions like Spain, we have seen a great reluctance to condemn the war in Iran. The Europeans have expressed some reservations about the fact that the war is not legal, that there are some questions about the aftermath, but they have been very, very careful not to antagonize the Trump administration because they fear potential repercussions, potential retaliation. I think another aspect of it, if we go beyond the rhetoric, if we go beyond the public debate, is the fact that even the European leaders who have expressed reservations about the war many of them have enabled the US war effort. Because as the United States conducts the war in Iran, in terms of logistics, in terms of command and control, in terms of communications, the US very much relies on its network of bases in Europe. And that is a very important factor that tends to be sidelined in the conversation.
Sure.
And finally, I would add one last point, which is that even though the Europeans so far have not been directly involved in the war, this possibility cannot be completely dismissed. If the war continues, if the economic disruptions get worse, if the Trump administration is more, I would say, persistent with its demand, if Iran retaliates against NATO countries more forcefully, we could see the beginning of a growing American involvement. And that could also be, of course, a very important story to follow.
Yeah, indeed. And I mean, you have Germany, for example, saying they're not going to take any part in this war, that the Ramstein base in Germany is a critical
Exactly.
node for the United States operationally in this war.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about how this war has led to the Trump administration sort of contradicting what has been its own approach to Europe since returning to office?
Yeah. So I think the starting point here would be to say that the Trump administration, at least the narrative, what the Trump administration has said is that it really wants to break from past American administrations, past American presidencies. There is this idea that America's allies have taken advantage of America for too long, especially the NATO allies, and that the Europeans they have to step up. The United States will not treat them as a vassal anymore. There will be more burden sharing, as mentioned in the National Defense Strategy. And there is also this idea that the Europeans are supposed to assume primary responsibility for their own defense. The United States will not be there forever doing most of the work. The problem, though, is that, and I think the Iran war is an illustration of that, but we have seen to an extent a kind of, I would say, implementation of that philosophy if we look at the concrete policies of the Trump administration. For example, we have seen some troop cuts from Europe. The American presence in Europe is slightly lower than it was during the Biden presidency. We have also seen important initiatives such as the 5% budget rule in NATO, this idea, this commitment made during the last annual NATO summit that by 2035, all NATO members except Spain will spend at least 5% of their GDP on defense and defense-related matters.
Right.
And that commitment was made to a large extent because the Trump administration was lobbying for it. So that's a sign of the Trump administration pushing for the Europeans to be more independent. I think another layer of that, and that's something that we see in the context of the Iran war, is that the Trump administration has not hesitated to be much more assertive, sometimes even, I would say, aggressive toward European countries, toward NATO allies. That could be in the form of threats, that could be in the form of insults, that could be things like that. We've seen that with the Greenland controversy. And if we look at the Iran war, as you know, we've seen a few days ago, President Trump express his frustration with NATO's reluctance to get involved in the war and describing NATO allies as cowards and explaining that NATO would have a very bad future if it doesn't want to help the United States in Iran. So I think that's also interesting. And that could suggest that, in a way, the United States does not care that much about the Europeans anymore. Or the United States maybe is trying to be very assertive towards Europe in order to shock the Europeans, in order to push them out of their comfort zone so that they assume more responsibility for their own defense. And I think that's an interesting idea. But to come back to the fundamentals of American policy towards Europe, if we leave aside the rhetoric, the narrative, and some of the policies that have been taking place on the margins, I think it's true that the Trump administration wants the Europeans to do more, clearly. But it doesn't mean that the Trump administration wants to give the keys to the Europeans. It doesn't mean that the Trump administration wants to abandon the key levers of influence, the key levers of power that have made Europe dependent on the United States for decades. So, for example, if we look at the military footprint of the United States in Europe today, as we mentioned earlier, it's about the same as it was during the Biden presidency.
Right.
If we look at economic policies, the Trump administration has imposed a number of economic policies on Europe, including buy American obligations on energy, on American weapon systems, which is very detrimental to the emergence of an independent Europe. We have also seen a desire to get more, I would say, to interfere more in the domestic politics of European countries. The Trump administration has claimed this very openly, explaining that Europe has to become more like the United States, otherwise it's going to decline further. We have also seen the Trump administration take strong steps to support American big tech companies that face potential regulation efforts by the European Union. And more broadly, we still see a great degree of hostility towards the European Union, which could be the main channel, of the emergence of an independent Europe. So if we take all of those things together, one thing that we should say is that this is nothing new. This is exactly what past American administrations have done. They have done all of those things, at least to an extent, including Europe-friendly president like Joe Biden. But to come back to the question, has there been a fundamental break between those administrations and the Trump administration? Well, if we leave aside the rhetoric, if we leave aside some policies here and there, I would argue that the fundamentals have not really changed. And the Iran war is a great illustration of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could also argue that the Ukraine war is a great illustration of that. I mean, I don't think the Trump administration's policy is that much different from the Biden administration's.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think your answer there really teed up nicely the last question that I wanted to ask you, which is kind of derived from this recent op-ed that you wrote in Modern Diplomacy, which I kind of thought was a nice counterintuitive take on how this war would impact the trajectory of U.S. European relations. And in that piece, essentially what you argued is that the war is more likely to make Europe more dependent on the United States, not less. So I'm wondering if you could walk us through that argument, Thomas.
Sure. So I think the Iran war, and you referred to those arguments that have been made out there, that the Iran war could be another episode of the Europeans realizing that they cannot trust the United States anymore, that the US does not care about their opinion anymore. And as a result, they could decide to push further towards strategic autonomy and strategic independence and so on. And of course, that would be seen in the context of the Greenland controversy, of trade disputes, and so on. So it would be another step, another episode in that broad trend, in that broad story. And I think the argument is interesting, and it's still an open-ended question. However, the argument I made in the op-ed that you mentioned, and what I think is actually more likely to happen, is that the war in Iran could exacerbate, I would say, the two most fundamental factors that have explained Europe's persistent dependence on the United States in recent years and even recent decades. First, it could exacerbate the European military dependence on the United States, the European dependence on the US to ensure European security. And second, it could also be a factor of division inside Europe. It could affect the unity that the Europeans would absolutely need in order to make all the reforms necessary for the emergence of a more autonomous Europe. So, for example, if we go back to the economic dimensions that we discussed earlier, we talked about inflation, we talked about energy supply disruptions. If we think about this from the perspective of European strategic autonomy, we could say that European leaders who have already struggled for so many years in the economic domain are probably less likely to invest significant amounts of money in their defense budgets if the war in Iran continues to take its toll on European economies. It wouldn't make sense from an electoral perspective, strategic perspective, and so on. And we could argue the same for investments in new technologies, including defense-relevant new technologies. Europe is already falling behind in those domains, largely because it doesn't make enough investments. And if the war in Iran continues to take its toll, it's not going to get any better. Mm-hmm. I would also connect this to the security dimensions of the Iran war and the connection with the war in Ukraine, which is to say that as the Europeans become more and more worried about the possibility that the Iran war is going to make the United States less interested in supporting Ukraine, less interested in pushing for peace negotiations, more interested in maybe finding a kind of compromise, a kind of deal with Russia, as Putin has tried to push, in the last few days. And as Russia benefits increasingly from energy supply disruptions in the Middle East and their global consequences, the Europeans find themselves in this position where European security, Ukraine security, but also more broadly European security, could be very much jeopardized. And they will basically face the choice between a long-term and uncertain option. Should we try to unite and overcome our national differences and make those big investments for possibly long-term rewards 10 or 15 years down the road in the form of European strategic autonomy? Or do we go to our usual go-to option, our traditional option, which is the United States? And in that case, we just try to please the Trump administration. We go along with the Trump administration as much as we can because we want to get as much as we can from the United States. And I think it's quite likely that European leaders would take that road. Finally, I would also think about this in terms of political and diplomatic divisions. If we think about the Iran war creating waves of refugees in Europe, if we think about the Iran war creating more economic difficulties in Europe, what do we have? We have more tensions between European countries. We have more tensions within European countries, within European societies. And we would also probably see the further rise of far-right movements in Europe, which all have their distinct features, but they are, to the extent we can generalize, they are not particularly pro-EU, they're not particularly pro-NATO, not particularly pro-European. So that would also be, a factor of division that would hurt the cause of European strategic autonomy. And I would add one last thing to this, which is that to an important extent as well, Europe's prospects in terms of strategic autonomy are defined by the actions that European leaders are taking today. And if we look at this, as we discussed earlier, there is this idea that the Europeans have not really had a strong response to the Iran war. They are uncomfortable, but they did not make a strong stand to a large extent because they did not want to antagonize the United States. And I see this could have two consequences that would be, I would say, negative for the emergence of European strategic autonomy. The first one is that along the way, European leaders have kind of neglected all of the things that they were supposed to stand for in international relations. That would be international law, that would be multilateralism, that would be support for the United Nations. They have not said much about this. And I think, of course, it's not the first time. We've seen many double standards before, but I think this silence or near silence is something that hurts the credibility of the Europeans on the global stage. And the other aspect of this is that Washington follows the response of European leaders very closely. And when Washington sees, when the US government sees this new display of weakness on the part of European leaders, the fact that European leaders are so, I would say, afraid of antagonizing the US that they do not say much about the Iran war, that they do not take a strong position, I think that the United States also sees this. And I think in that sense, it could further incentivize the United States to make more demands in the future, to squeeze the Europeans even more in the future, because American leaders will make the assessment pretty logically that they can afford it, and European leaders will still go along with it.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Thomas. I mean, that was a really robust, interesting explanation of your argument there. I mean, I would just say, in closing, it's incredible. We're not even a month into this war, and the ripple effects, whether it's in U.S. European relations and in global energy policy. I mean, it's incredible to see the ripple effects, in such a short period of time. I want to thank you a lot, Thomas, for joining me today and giving such a great explanation of Europe's position on this war and how it could impact the trajectory of U.S. European relations. And I just want to encourage everybody watching to head over to defensepriorities.org, read all the pieces that Thomas is writing right now and all the other experts are on the Iran war. So thanks a lot, Thomas.
Well, thank you, Adam. Thank you very much for the opportunity.